All right, so our next speaker is Andrew Findlay. I've known Andrew for many years, and he's got many years' experience in X500 and LDAP. I'll just bring him on.
We sort of agreed we'd try and save a bit of time on this, so my bio is online. If you want real details, you'll have to go look it up. But the quick version is I've been involved in directories since just about before X500 was originally standardized. Mostly around the fringes as an administrator type for systems. So I said I'd come and talk about best practices in LDAP security, and I'm going to be a bit contentious. I'm going to say some things which I know some of you are going to disagree with, and that's good. And I'm hoping that if I stir you up enough, you might give me a hand with this project, because this is a project. The idea came originally from SANS, who is an organization that run system admin and network security conferences. I went to one of theirs years ago. And sometime about a year ago, they put out a call for people to build and coordinate best practices checklists for a variety of things. I thought, yeah, perhaps we could do with one for LDAP, and the advantage of doing this for SANS is that they have a lot of influence in the security and auditing professions. So I thought if we got some sensible best practices put together, then when the auditors descend on something that we have built, maybe they will audit it according to rules that we wrote, rather than rules that say nobody can have everything and nobody can even know that, which is their normal starting point. So that's the background to this, and we'll see how we get on with it. Obviously, the topic is too big. We had a 10-page limit for the paper, and I soon ran out of that, and we have, well, actually rather less than 40 minutes to talk, and I'm never going to cover the topic in that. What is security? And we need to define one or two terms before I get too far into the details. So you need to pick somewhere you're going to take definitions from, and for this purpose, I'm taking the ISO 27K series, which seems to be quite a commonly used set of standards. Nice thing about standards, there are so many to choose from. This is quite a reasonable set, but of course it's big. So let's just stick to some of the definitions from it. Security, many things to many people. Security, it could be the chap outside the nightclub. It could be, if you look it up on a dictionary, shares in the stock market. And that doesn't feel terribly secure to me at the moment. The state of feeling safe. I think that's getting a bit closer. Feeling safe, you notice, not being safe. There is a difference. So ISO 27K, it's a whole series of standards, but 27,000, the one with all the zeros on it, you can get for free. You don't even have to pay for it, which is unusual for ISO. And it's got the definitions that are used in a lot of the other standards. So we can find that they regard information security principally as these three characteristics: confidentiality, the property that information is not made available or disclosed to unauthorized individuals, entities, or processes. I think that's reasonable. Integrity. It's the property of protecting the accuracy and completeness of assets, where an asset has a really broad definition. They say anything that has value to the organization. Well, I'm going to just stick to data for the moment. And availability, the property of being accessible and usable upon demand by an authorized entity. And it's very important to remember that one. Too many security officers enforce the confidentiality and the integrity at the expense of availability. They forget that the reason we're doing all of this, we're keeping it secure so that we can actually use it. If they prevent us, the users, from using it, then actually they've failed. So don't forget availability. There are a few other things around. Authenticity, accountability, non-repudiation, reliability, lots of illities, things you ought to do. But I very much agree with these headline topics. I'd come up with that list before I found ISO 27K, and the same list appears in several other standards. Another word we need, a control. It's a means of managing risk. It could be technical, it could be organizational, it could be legal. Notice, again, managing, not eliminating. Politicians and the press seem to want us to eliminate risk from daily life. It can't be done. We have to manage it. We have to have some idea of what it is, what the threats are, what the consequences are, so we can assess how dangerous particular things are, and therefore whether we should be doing anything to protect them or not. There can be lots of controls. They should be appropriately chosen. They will be different in every environment. Some of them, yes, okay, are going to be fairly similar. Things like you have a machine running an LDAP server, you shouldn't really let ordinary random users log on to the thing, certainly not as root. But there are lots of other things where the controls may be appropriate in one environment, not in another. So it's going to be a list. And today's talk is to encourage all of you to contribute things to my list, our list, I hope. I'm going to talk mostly about technical controls, but if the technical controls don't match in with organization and with people, with the human factors, they're not going to work. Let's start with accounts. Most systems need accounts. A lot of LDAP systems are installed purely to manage accounts. Now this is the difference between the original X500 vision and the way LDAP is being used today. So we're no longer a global directory, we're a corporate directory. It's a different job. This is why Active Directory is probably the biggest installed LDAP-capable thing. I'm not going to call it an LDAP server because it isn't really. It wasn't designed for that, but it's LDAP accessible. It's there to run corporate environments. So it's there to manage accounts. All right. I was going to say typical. The organisation I used to work in, Brunel University, West London, smallish educational institution, 23,000 people, roughly. I went back there as a consultant a few years ago, and I did a sort of audit of their directory-like things. I found 23 databases, which all separately kept copies of people's names and contact details. And some of them were linked up, and some of them weren't. Inevitably, most of them were out of date. So my first control, you must have automated update for your accounts from an authoritative source. So if the directory itself is not the authoritative source, if people are not self-registering on it because it's your website user thing, then you should update automatically from human resources, student management, whatever. That still leaves you the problem. Take that university as an example. When I built its first directory in 1988, roughly, I thought, this is going to be easy. I'm friends with the admin. I'll go and I'll get the personnel records, and I'll get the student records. There were no data protection laws at the time, so it was easy. Add those together, we'll have everybody. Fine. Loaded that, and then I loaded the email data, which I controlled. Oh, another 5,000 people. it turns out that we don't employ half the staff. They must be paid by some other means because they still seem to turn up to work. But they're not on the payroll. And in fact, this is a very common model now in most organizations. Contractors probably outnumber permanent staff. So you need the database of everybody else. And who maintains that? That's an organizational problem. You need an organizational control for it. I'll probably put it into the list, but it's getting a bit fringe for LDAP. All right, first contentious one. Accounts should never, ever be deleted. Anyone object to this? You're thinking about it. You would, good. Right, you can write another control for me, which says accounts should be deleted. And the reason I say they should not be deleted is they contain history. A person who once worked for you had an account, they did things on your systems identified by that account. If you delete that account, you now cannot process your log files and your audit records because you've lost the link to the person. The other reason for keeping the account is it reserves their identifier, reserves their username so that you cannot use it again. It reserves their Unix UID and GID, so particularly the UID, you cannot use it again. You should never reuse identifiers. I don't need to put that into the LDAP best practice, though I probably will. That goes back to the DoD Orange Book, and that's at least as old as half the people in this room. So that has been a standard for a long time. Never reuse an identifier, because as soon as you do, you're not quite sure who your audit logs refer to, or who owns that file. You give a new ID to a student coming in, it turns out that they now own the ex-Vice-Chancellor's files, which we thought we'd deleted, but we hadn't. Similarly, never change a DN. DNs crop up all over the place, they're stored outside the directory. Whatever access I might have to try and enforce data consistency within the directory, I can't control what other people have done. And if they're using DNs as a link into the directory, if I change somebody's DN, I've broken it. So don't. There's an error on this slide. It should say at the top, don't use passwords. I've been telling people not to use passwords for rather a long time, completely without effect. I use passwords. I have lots of them, probably about 200. Consultants sort of accumulate passwords. But even if it was just my personal ones, I have a different password for every website. So yeah, you've got lots of passwords. But you should certainly never let the password leave the client. Passwords are dangerous enough. Between me and the keyboard, somebody is probably watching. There are cameras around here. I'm not going to type a password here. I don't want the password to pass over the network, so keep it in the client. We don't want to trust the network. I don't really want to trust the server, because at this stage I don't even know whether I'm talking to the right server, or whether somebody's put a password grabber on that server. Now, that's a very useful thing to do, actually. As an LDAP administrator, grab people's passwords as they go past, and I can do password synchronization for them. Wonderful service, yes. But it may not be a good thing to have in your security policy. So really what we should be doing is saying everybody should be using client-side certificates with TLS. That provides what the crypto people call a zero-knowledge proof. I can prove to you over the wire that I know a particular secret without revealing any part of it. Very useful thing to be able to do. And as Steve said yesterday, at the very least, you should use this on your high-value links. Replication. Even if the replication is on a trusted network, trusted in quotation marks, because it may not be trustworthy, even if you do trust it, you don't want to expose to one server the ability to impersonate another server, just in case one of them's compromised. So client-side certificates are good. You can even keep the keys in secure hardware, in a smart card, things like that. Failing that, TLS and Kerberos. Kerberos has similar properties, probably easier to deploy in a corporate type environment. That's why Microsoft use it. And it keeps the passwords rather more local. However, we still use passwords. So if you've got to, still use TLS. You're going to get bored hearing about TLS. Use SASL Scram. Kurt will tell you about that next. This also avoids exposing the passwords to the server. It's much better in that sense than some of the other SASL mechanisms. The server never has to actually know what your password is or have anything that it can use to impersonate you to another server. Unfortunately, a lot of servers and clients don't yet have the Scram modules available in their SASL libraries. So that's a future, but it's a future that we should bring forward. We drop down ultimately to TLS plus simple bind. This is a requirement. Everybody has to support this. All LDAP servers, if they allow authentication at all, must do this. So this really is the absolute minimum that's acceptable between a client and a server. Never, ever pass a password to anywhere without at least encrypting the session. There's another gotcha with passwords, and I've put it in here as a security control because it translates into a denial of service on the users if you get it wrong. This will not affect any Americans in the audience because your keyboards are incapable of causing the problem. It doesn't affect many people in the UK because there are only two symbols on our keyboards that can cause the problem, the pound sign and the euro sign. The problem is non-ASCII. It shouldn't be a problem really, should it? Directory, everything's UTF-8, right? No, not a password. Password is a bit string. And the server doesn't know what character set you're using. Only your client knows that. So your desktop might be set up in ISO 8859, and the server can't tell. So I type my password here with some nice umlauts. I've got several keys with umlauts here. I can make some nice, interesting passwords. And then I go home, and I'm set up there with a UTF-8 system, and I type my password correctly, and it doesn't work. Denial of service. Availability, not good. Okay, storing passwords, don't. Don't have passwords, don't store them. Well, okay, we can't get away from that always. If you're using Kerberos, you don't need to store passwords. If you're using X509 client-side, you don't need to store passwords. In practice, we've got to store something that we can use to validate passwords. It's a shame, but there it is. If you store anything, then you're subject to a number of attacks by anybody who can steal your backup tapes, for example. At the very least, don't follow the standard. The standard says you store passwords in clear text in the user password attribute. And that's because the X500 model says anything you put into the directory, you get back exactly what you put in. Exactly what you put in. So the default in most servers started off being, it's just another attribute. Store it in clear text. Well, obviously, that is not acceptable. The default in a lot of the commercial servers now is to use AES 256, 256-bit encryption. Wonderful. Absolute rubbish. Completely useless. Because it's reversible. Where's the encryption key? It's on the same disk in clear text. It has to be. Otherwise, the server can't boot. It's on your backup tapes in clear text. Otherwise, the server can't boot after you've done a recovery from the disaster. So, typically, you take one of these commercial directory servers, and I could extract all of your passwords in clear text, because that's what the standard says. So don't. Use a hash, and use a strong one. And these days, that has to be at least SHA-1. It's okay for now, but not for much longer. MD5 is now regarded as a bit weak. SHA-1 is showing cracks. we should be using something from the SHA-2 series, and they're already working on the competition for SHA-3. So hashes, like everything else in crypto, it's an arms race. So we've got to stay ahead. Just use it, and always use lots of salt. Lots and lots of salt. The original Unix password file system had 12 bits of salt, which was really very clever at the time, and it gave wonderful protection in the days when the best available machine was a VAX 750 to do your password cracking. 4,096 different ways of encrypting one password isn't enough these days. So 32 bits, 48 bits, it's cheap. Buy it by the ton, use lots of salt. Password policies, oh, I hate them. But the auditors like them, you've got to have them. Draft Behera's been around for forever. It never has become an RFC, probably never will, due to certain philosophical differences between people in this room. Yes, it has lots of faults. It's mixing password policy with account policy with all sorts of stuff. But sorry, we've got to do it. But there are good bits and bad bits even so. If you implement all of the things that the auditors want you to implement, then you're breaking my rule about human factors. Humans are smart, policies are dumb. The humans will win. If you make life too difficult for the humans in terms of password complexity and how often they change it and how often they reuse passwords, they will find a way around it. At the very least, it's the yellow post-it notes all the way around the edge of the screen. You'll probably find that the senior admin, the CEO, has the weakest password, and if the yellow post-it note is not on his screen, it's in his top drawer, which if you're lucky is locked. You've made it too hard for him. Try to find another way. Don't do N strikes lockout. Here I think I'm disagreeing with Sean from the previous talk. I don't like N strikes lockout. It provides the bad guys with a very, very easy denial of service. The typical thing is to set up 3, 4, 5, maybe at the most 10 password failures before you lock the account. Well, somebody with a botnet can wipe out your entire user base in about 10 minutes. So even if you're re-enabling the accounts after half an hour or so, they can keep you locked out. It's not worth it. The reason people used to do password lockout is to prevent password guessing. In the days when you had a terminal and a modem, and the only way of attacking a system was to guess a username or steal one, and then try passwords, like password with a 0 in it, password with a few ones on the end. And usually in the end you'd get there. That's not how the attackers work these days. It's changed. Look at what a botnet is doing. Look at how they attack your mail systems. I was analyzing one of my mail system logs the other day because I noticed a very odd pattern. We reject 40,000 mail messages a day at SMTP time. This is a small mail server, I say, add. We've got less than 1,000 accounts. We reject almost all of those in a 2-hour period, the same 2-hour period every day. Funny, somebody's attacking us. Maybe I can stop this. There are 10,000 different IP addresses producing those 20,000 failures. So I would have to do 1 strike failure lockout to even catch the second attempt. The world has moved on. Password lockout is not good. All sorts of client config errors will trigger this. Somebody who's got a smartphone which they configured to read their email, and it's trying to do an update of their email every minute, and they've forgotten to update the password on the smartphone, it's going to keep them locked out of all the rest of their accounts forever. And, oh, well, sorry, the smartphone's by the bed at home, and the chief exec is in Beijing on an important visit, and he needs his email. You've locked him out. Availability. Okay, access control, I'm not going to say a great deal about this. I could go on for hours. I have talked for hours in previous conferences about access control. It's a big topic. It was never standardized. Well, it was actually X500 1993. And we all looked at it and said, ugh, that's baroque and complicated, and we'll never use that. We want something simpler. So we implemented something a lot more complicated. And to be fair, a lot more useful. There are one or two projects, I think, that are now starting to use the 93 access control. And I've got to go back and have a go with it and see whether I can really make it work. Even the simple schemes are complex. Access control is implementing policy, and the policy is fuzzy. This is programmer territory. You don't want to be changing access control rules as a routine thing. You don't want data administrators to do it. Preferably, you don't want a provisioning system even to do it. Use programmers. Treat it like a software upgrade if you have to change it. It could have at least that much damaging effect if you get it wrong. And write a test suite. I find test suites for access control really, really good, because you can go to the people who are setting the policy and you can say, right, here are some people. Over there is the office cleaner, and here's the chief exec, and here's me, and here's an account administrator. Is the office cleaner allowed to read the chief exec's home phone number? Well, obviously not. Right. That goes into the test suite, and it helps me refine my idea of what the policy really is. And once you've got about 100 of these questions and answers, and you've written them into your test suite, then you can start writing the ACLs. Then you might have some idea what's going on. ACLs may not be enough. Size limits, structure rules. You've got to protect your directory in all sorts of different ways. I could probably get 50 controls out of this slide alone. I'd better move on. DIT design. Another thing I talk about on far too often, probably. The original thing from the X500 standards, that DN, apart from being converted into LDAP form, is lifted verbatim from X501 1988. It's an example from the standard. And it's bad. If I want to provide access to an anonymous user to any data of this person, I'm exposing to this anonymous person not only this person's surname, but also the department they work and the location they work at. I cannot avoid it, because I cannot hand over any data from an LDAP server without also handing over the DN. Don't put interesting information in the DNs if you might never want an anonymous person to see it. That means that directory servers that I design are not browsable nicely with things like Apache Directory Studio. I have some ideas for that, and I probably ought to be talking to the studio developers about it, because this really needs fixing. Software developers use these browsers. They're not end-user tools. It doesn't matter really what the tree looks like, and we are used to dealing with cryptic stuff. We'd better get used to dealing with cryptic directory trees, because we've got to hide the structure. It's worse than that. Most directory servers in the world can't even hide the existence of an entry. If I can guess the name of an entry, I can almost certainly tell you whether it exists or not. Not in OpenLDAP Recent. I know that one hides it. Every commercial server I've tested can't be done, can't hide it. You cannot, even with OpenLDAP, hide a non-leaf entry if you can see a leaf entry underneath it. It's the DN problem again. Replication. Why am I talking about replication? This is security. Availability, right? We need availability. Replication is really good for read availability. It gives us resilience, it gives us performance. We can lower the round trip time, and however fast our network, the speed of light does not get faster. So here to Beijing, it's quite a long time. It's no good Howard saying he can do me a search in less than a millisecond at thousands and thousands per second if the server is in London and the client is in Los Angeles. Totally pointless. It takes 300 milliseconds to get round and back, something like that. So you need replication. They're not so good for write availability. Every server has to process every write. We heard about this in terms of designing high throughput systems with big HP servers earlier. You've got to have lots of throughput for writes if you're doing writes. Multi-master, it still doesn't solve that problem, but at least it gives you better availability for writes in the face of failures. Unfortunately, you're now risking integrity. There are some combinations of changes you can make to two servers simultaneously, or while the network's down, that cannot be resolved by any protocol you care to mention between the two. It's just fundamentally impossible. So we've now risked our integrity in order to get better availability for writes. We have to make that decision, but we should make it with our eyes open. So I'm going to say that's a control. The other thing that really is good for security is subset replica. If I have a firewall and I put a replica outside the firewall that only contains public data that I'm willing to give to everybody, then that's good. If they attack that server and break it, they still can't pinch anything that's not public. All networks are broken. Assume they're compromised. And all firewalls are evil. And yes, I know that one's contentious. But in my time as a consultant, I dread to think how many days I have been paid for while I have sat in somebody's office waiting for them to fix their firewall rules so that I can actually get at the thing that I need to get at to do the job they've employed me for. And also watching while other people all the way around the office can't do their job because the firewall's done something odd. Availability, please. It matters. Firewall administrators are paranoid. They don't even want you to be able to detect that there's a firewall there. They don't want you to know that they're refusing to do something for you. It's beneath their dignity to send a TCP reset packet when they drop your connection. Right, okay. So I've got a long-lived connection through a firewall from the office network to the LDAP server. And it's all very nice. And as the consultant, I say, okay, good. Performance wonderful, I'm going home. Next morning, they phone me up at 9 o'clock and say, nobody can get at the LDAP. Why? And then 25 minutes later, oh, it's all working again. They all had long-lived LDAP sessions, and the firewall dropped them when they were idle for an hour. But it didn't bother to tell them. So their client is just sitting there sending retry packets. And the firewall's saying, nah, won't tell you. I'm here, won't tell you. You don't have to be that paranoid to be secure. Okay, let's talk about things that do make it secure. SSL? No, don't do SSL. It was never standardized, as far as I know. And maybe someone in this room can tell me. I went looking for a document that described LDAP over SSL because I wanted to reference it in the paper. Couldn't find one. As far as I can tell, it just happened. Probably somebody in Netscape said, oh, we've got this SSL thing that we've put in the browser for yellow padlocked web pages. Let's put it on the LDAP bit as well, because LDAP was in the browser at the time. So I think they just did it. Anyway, SSL hasn't been updated for years. Arms race, right? The bad guys are winning. SSL is now weak. I was going to say it's deprecated. I had to find something to reference to say it was deprecated. I couldn't. And then I realized it had never been cated in the first place. You can't deprecate something that was never standardized. Back to the firewalls. Lots of organizations say, oh, you can have port 636, but you can't have port 389. Only secure ports through our firewall, please. Well, it's a number. It's nothing more than that. It's amazing how many organizations with a default deny guest network you can get out of on port 443. You know, you can run a SSH over 443 and they let it through because they want to be able to get to Tesco's website to order lunch. It's a number. 636 is not more secure than 389. It's just a bigger number. If your policy requires everything to be encrypted, then good. Make the clients request encryption and make the servers enforce that before they give away any data. Unfortunately, SSL is still better than nothing, and a disgusting number of clients still can't do the job properly, including some big-name products that I work with. Oh dear. Well, actually, the one that I work with, which is a problem, which is IBM Directory Integrator, there is a workaround because you can get down into the Java level. And you can do this, TLS. You should always do TLS because, as I said earlier, your networks are not trustworthy. You should run your own certification authority, not just because you're a cheapskate, but because you control the policy. What is the policy of Network Solutions or Thought or DigiNotar? Does it match what you want? Do their certificates mean what you want them to mean? No, probably not. They're there for a different purpose. Run your own. It's not hard. It takes one line of shell script, OpenSSL, and a config file, which is not that hard to write. Use client-side certificates. Issue them for things like server admin, replication, that sort of stuff. Don't allow passwords on those. And don't trust any data that you read before you started TLS, because the bad guys could change it. Not that hard. I won't tell you the story of Alice and Bob and Charles, but do look up the after-dinner speech for Alice and Bob and Charles. It's another piece of human factors. So, server setup, good practice, obvious. Staff harden the operating system. How about not running the LDAP server as root? I mean, it's a Unix convention. Every port under 1024, you have to be root to bind it. But actually, no. We haven't had to do that since POSIX something.something. All you have to do is give the catnet bind service capability to the process. And then it can bind the low number port. And that's the only reason we were ever starting these things as root. You don't need to run them as root. You don't even need to start them as root. Check your file permissions. I've lost count of the number of big commercial products that I've installed which have gone in on Unix mode 777 for all files, and presumably the same equivalent on Windows. It's harder to check on Windows because you've got to point and click every blasted file. You can't list the permissions. Well, actually, no, it's easy. You just log in as an unprivileged user and you say, oh, I'm going to edit that. Oh, yes, I can. Oh, dear. File permissions are critical. Remember that encryption key that was stored on the disk? What's protecting the encryption key? File permissions, nothing else. Back-end database permissions. If you're storing data in a relational database at the back, as a lot of the commercial products do, make sure that that database is secure. It's not using default passwords. They almost all come with default passwords. Availability. Check that the passwords to access the back-end database are not going to expire. These are probably auto-created system accounts. 2 weeks later, by default, back-end password expires. You get some really weird LDAP error messages. Check your open files limits. This is all availability stuff again. If you've got a busy server, it's going to need more than 1024 files open at once. It might need 65,000 TCP sessions open at once. Who knows? But check the numbers. Look out for your add-on security settings. This is part of hardening, but it's also part of tripping yourself up and shooting yourself in the foot. If you use a slightly non-standard config and you've got SE Linux or AppArmor or something like that, then you can end up with something that doesn't work. And the error messages may not even exist. strace is my favorite tool for finding things that the error messages don't tell me, but you get really weird stuff out of that. You find it's got permission denied when it tried to open this config file. But I'm running this as root, and even the ordinary user can read this config file. Oh yes, but the ordinary user hasn't got an SE Linux profile. Therefore, it's not restricted from reading that file. So watch out, it can be awkward. Testing. The military have a saying that a message is not delivered until it's been acknowledged. I could sort of paraphrase that and say that a system is not delivered until it's testable. And where security is concerned, that probably goes double. Testing these things for security is difficult. Where you've got horrible, great, complex policies with lots of access control rules, you need a big test suite. And it needs to be permanent. It's delivered to your customer as part of the product. They should run it, preferably against the live service occasionally, certainly against the development service before they put a new thing into production. You've got to test every access control aspect. You've got to test the limits. You've got to test the authentication. Does it work? Does it stop the right things? Does it allow the right things? You've got to test that TLS is there. Oh, and you need a 10-year diary. If you're installing TLS, you've got to make sure somebody replaces the certificates before they expire. So run the tests frequently and build a very large set of dummy data. Don't let the application developers work against an LDAP server with 5 entries in that they put there. You need to keep them honest. You've got to have lots and lots of data, and it's got to look very much like your production data. But it must not be the production data. That's illegal. Well, okay, no, it isn't. But it's unnecessary to expose real personal data to developers on the developer network. The developers don't want to have to be bothered with the security. They can't be all the time. They must not have critical data. So you need a big set of test data. Design the thing for non-stop production. This is possible with LDAP. You can do major software upgrades without stopping the apps. So design it that way. It takes a bit of thought before you go into production, but with proxies and load balancers and things like that, you can make it work. Non-stop. And finally, I come back to human factors. Your legitimate users, the real ones, your friends, they are the biggest risk. The second biggest risk is their desktop machine. That's where most of the bad stuff happens. So educate them, don't fight them. Keep them on your side. And remember that the LDAP server can only enforce policies on things that it can see. Other applications have a broader view and maybe should enforce more policies. So, for the future, I want to carry on collecting these. I want to turn this into something that SANS will rubber stamp so that the auditors, and by this I mean the sort of chartered accountant firms, big money auditors will believe in, which means we need a lot of stuff written out in some fairly formal ways. So, in the best traditions of the internet, it's up to you. I've built the wiki. Here it is. If you are interested in this, please contact me, get an account. This is not a self-registration wiki, but anybody who's come to this conference, I will happily give accounts to. Anybody who posts on LDAP-related mailing lists, I will happily give accounts to. And you can then edit anything. So if you disagree with what I'm saying, we can have an edit war. That would be wonderful. Thank you. Very few questions, I think.
One of the things I noticed you didn't really talk too much about is privacy considerations. And I think that's something that you have to factor in from day one.
Absolutely, yes.
And that's
that was
when you
slide
ask your
27 of the ACLs slide.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's one of the reasons on count deletion I actually said yes. But what I should qualify that is you can keep the base account as long as it's not personal identifying information in the account name. but you are most likely in many environments you're going to be legislatively required to delete all the personal identifying information that's associated with that account.
Yes, but you're also, in those same environments, typically required to keep some of it for 7 years. So you've got a bit of a chicken and egg. Yes, you should delete it. You should certainly take it off the production services, but you should leave a stub. And for those reasons, just as I say you should have rather opaque DNs, you should have rather opaque account login IDs, so that when you do this, there is nothing left that means something. But yes, I would agree. Privacy, very much so. I'm working, in fact, with the Apache Foundation at the moment on a project which is going to do a community directory where privacy is very much designed in. So we'll see what happens, yes.
I'm not going to touch the password thing. I think I'm with you on it. Passwords suck. It's time to get rid of them. The thing on keeping accounts around forever, I do have a problem with that. And I've seen that in production, in databases and stuff like that. And you just end up just with a lot of data that just grows and grows, particularly with busy data sets. So why not have a history, and maintain the history forever and archive the history, but clear out the original data set?
I think it depends on your environment. And yes, I'm not expecting you to take all of these things literally. But if we're talking... So, yeah, good. If you're talking about a self-register website, then you need to keep something around for a while to prevent the account IDs being reused. But other than that, maybe you don't need much. If you're talking about an LDAP server that is driven purely from an HR system, then the provisioning system that sits between them just needs to make sure it never reuses an ID, because that's what I really care about. I don't actually care that the ID still stays in the directory. It's just easy if you've got an LDAP-based provisioning system to say, we've got a uniqueness constraint on this, and it's still in there, so you can't clash with it.
And you're talking, that could be an internal ID. It wouldn't have to be an external ID, because user IDs, especially in large user populations, why not let them reuse that? As long as you've got the internal ID that maps to the original user in a database, for history purposes, that should be good enough, right?
It depends on what your accountability has to be. For a lot of sites, the only accountability there is a verified email address. So you may have to store that somewhere until whatever laws govern you say that you no longer have to tell people what happened, which might be a month, might be 5 seconds, might be 7 years. It's gone quiet. Right, I'm getting off the stage.